Elizabeth Garland's hands trembled as she clutched the letter announcing her husband's death. The paper crackling like autumn leaves in the dry Texas wind, sweeping through San Elizario. The year was 1878, and at 26, she was now a widow with 3 young daughters and a struggling ranch that stretched across 60 acres of unforgiving desert borderland. "Mama, when's Papa coming home?" 6-year-old Catherine asked, tugging at Elizabeth's skirt as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. Elizabeth knelt beside her daughter, gathering Catherine and her sister's 8-year-old Josephine and 4-year-old Rebecca into her arms. "Your Papa isn't coming home, darlings. He's gone to heaven." The news of Thomas Garland's death in a stagecoach robbery spread through San Elizario like wildfire. He had been the backbone of their modest cattle operation, and now Elizabeth was left alone to manage everything while caring for 3 young girls in a land where a woman's place was firmly believed to be in the home. 2 weeks after the funeral, Elizabeth stood on her porch, staring at the parched landscape. The cattle needed moving to better grazing land, debts needed paying, and the ranch hands were already looking elsewhere for work. She had learned much from Thomas during their 9 years of marriage, but the men in town made it clear they didn't believe a woman could run a cattle ranch. "You should sell, Mrs. Garland," Spencer Thornton, the local banker, advised when she visited town to discuss her loans. "A woman with no sons has no business trying to keep a ranch afloat. Your girls need a proper upbringing, not to be raised like wild things on a failing property." Elizabeth straightened her back. "My daughters and I will manage just fine, Mr. Thornton." The banker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The bank has extended considerable credit to your late husband. I'm afraid we'll need to call in those loans within 6 months, unless you can demonstrate the operation's viability." As Elizabeth left the bank, whispers followed her down the dusty main street of San Elizario. "Poor thing," Mrs. Henderson clucked to Mrs. Morris outside the general store. "No sons to take over. Those girls will be her downfall. If only she'd had a boy," Mr. Peterson remarked loudly to the blacksmith. "No ranch survives on female hands." Elizabeth clutched her reticule tighter, her knuckles white as bone as she loaded supplies into her wagon. The taunt stung worse than the Texas sun beating down on her fair skin. 9 years of marriage, 3 pregnancies, and each time Thomas had assured her that daughters were just as precious as sons. But now she wondered if he truly believed that or had merely been consoling her. On the lonely ride back to the ranch, Elizabeth allowed herself to cry, the tears mingling with the dust on her cheeks. When the wagon crested the final hill before home, she wiped her face clean. Her daughters were waiting, and they needed her strength, not her despair. The following morning, Elizabeth woke before dawn and pulled on Thomas's old work clothes. She'd need to take inventory of the cattle and determine which could be sold to make the next loan payment. As she prepared to leave, Josephine appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I'm coming with you, Mama," she announced, already dressed in her father's old shirt, which hung to her knees. "This isn't ladies' work, Joe," Elizabeth said softly. "Then I won't be a lady today," her daughter replied with a determined tilt of her chin. "Papa showed me how to count the herd last summer." With a nod, Elizabeth handed her a hat, and together they rode out to the western pasture. By midday, their count was troubling. They'd lost more cattle to rustlers and drought than Thomas had let on before his death. They would need help, and soon. It was Josephine who spotted the rider approaching from the north, a tall figure silhouetted against the brutal afternoon sun. Elizabeth instinctively reached for the rifle strapped to her saddle. Rustlers had grown bold in these parts. "Hands where I can see them," she called out as the stranger drew closer. The rider slowed his horse, raising both hands. "Madam, I mean no harm. Name's Mason Hayes. I'm looking for work." Elizabeth kept the rifle steady. "There's no work here." Mason Hayes was a striking figure atop his roan stallion, broad-shouldered with a sun-weathered face that suggested years on the trail. His eyes, clear and blue as a desert sky, assessed the situation quickly. "With respect, madam, I'd say there is. Your north fence line is down in 3 places. You've got cattle scattered across 2 counties. And your water rights are about to be challenged by the Sandersons from up north." He gestured toward the distant hills. "I worked for your husband last spring during the cattle drive to Kansas. He spoke highly of you and your girls." Elizabeth lowered the rifle slightly. "You knew Thomas?" "Yes, madam. He saved my life during an Apache raid. Said if I ever needed work, I could find it here." Mason's gaze traveled over the neglected ranch. "Heard about his passing when I came through El Paso. Thought you might need an extra hand." Josephine tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, we need help." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "There's a bunkhouse behind the main house. It's not much, but you're welcome to it if you're willing to work for food and little pay until we get back on our feet." Mason nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That'll do just fine, Mrs. Garland." Over the next few weeks, Mason proved himself invaluable. He repaired fences, rounded up stray cattle, and even negotiated with the Sandersons regarding water rights, securing an agreement that benefited both ranches. Elizabeth found herself watching him from the kitchen window as he worked, his movements efficient and purposeful. One evening, after the girls were asleep, Elizabeth sat on the porch calculating figures in her ledger. The ranch was still in dire straits, but Mason's help had bought them time. "Mind some company?" Mason asked, climbing the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee. "Please." She gestured to the chair beside her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Mason spoke. "You've got a good operation here, Mrs. Garland, or you could have. With some changes and hard work, this ranch could flourish." Elizabeth sighed. "The bank doesn't think a woman can run a ranch, especially one with no sons to inherit." Mason's expression hardened. "That's horseshit, begging your pardon, madam." Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh. "No offense taken, Mr. Hayes. It's Mason, please." He took a sip of his coffee. "My mother ran our family ranch in Colorado after my father died. Had 4 daughters and me, the youngest. She taught us all how to ride, rope, and run cattle better than any man I've known. And yet everywhere I go in town, I hear whispers about my lack of sons, as if my daughters are somehow less capable because of their gender." Mason's gaze was steady. "Then daughters will build your legacy, Mrs. Garland. They just need the chance to prove themselves." Elizabeth felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee spread through her chest. "It's Elizabeth," she said quietly. The following Sunday, Elizabeth and her daughters attended church in San Elizario. Mason accompanied them, cleaned up in a pressed shirt and his least weathered hat. As they walked down the aisle to their usual pew, Elizabeth felt the stares and heard the hushed comments. Hired hands getting mighty comfortable with the widow Garland. Shameful, parading around with him not 2 months after poor Thomas was put in the ground. Elizabeth held her head high, but her cheeks burned with humiliation. After the service, as they gathered outside, Spencer Thornton approached with his wife. "Mrs. Garland, a word if you please." The banker's voice was cool. "I've been informed that you've hired additional help despite your financial situation. The bank is concerned about these expenditures." Before Elizabeth could respond, Mason stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton, I believe you've misunderstood the situation. I'm working for room and board to help Mrs. Garland get the ranch back on solid footing. No additional expenditures involved." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "And what stake do you have in this arrangement, Mr. Hayes?" "Just honoring a promise to a good man," Mason replied evenly. "Thomas Garland would have wanted his family's legacy protected." Thornton sniffed. "Legacy? What legacy can there be without sons to carry on the Garland name?" 3 girls can't run a ranch. They'll marry and take their husbands' names, and that will be the end of the Garland property. Elizabeth felt her daughters press closer to her skirts, and anger flared in her chest. My daughters are Garlands through and through, Mr. Thornton. They have their father's spirit and determination. They'll inherit the ranch and decide its future for themselves. A foolish notion, Mrs. Thornton interjected. Girls need proper upbringing, not to be raised like savages on a cattle ranch. They should be learning needlepoint and piano, not branding and fence mending. My daughters will learn both, Elizabeth declared. They'll be as comfortable in a parlor as they are in a saddle, and they'll have choices that many women in this town could only dream of. As they walked back to the wagon, Mason helped each girl up before turning to Elizabeth. You were magnificent, he said quietly, his hand lingering on hers as he assisted her onto the seat. I was terrified, she admitted. That's what makes it magnificent. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and Elizabeth felt a flutter in her stomach that she hadn't experienced since Thomas first courted her. Summer turned to fall, and with Mason's help, the ranch began to show signs of recovery. They sold enough cattle to make the loan payment, and Elizabeth started to believe they might actually survive. The girls adored Mason, especially after he began teaching them to ride properly and handle the gentler horses. One crisp October afternoon, Elizabeth found Josephine and Mason in the corral, working with a young mare. Remember, Joe, you have to be firm but gentle, Mason was saying as he guided her hands on the reins. A horse can sense your fear or confidence. Elizabeth watched as her daughter's face lit up with determination, her small hands steady as she guided the mare around the enclosure. She's a natural, Elizabeth commented as she approached the fence. Mason nodded, pride evident in his expression. All your girls have a way with the animals. Catherine has a knack for calming the skittish ones, and even little Rebecca can spot a sick calf faster than most cowhands. You've been good for them, Elizabeth said softly. They've blossomed under your guidance. They're remarkable children, Elizabeth. They take after their mother. Mason's eyes held warmth that made her heart skip. I've been meaning to discuss something with you. Before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property, and Elizabeth recognized Spencer Thornton flanked by 2 men she didn't know. Stay with Josephine, she instructed Mason before walking to meet the visitors. Mrs. Garland, Thornton called out, dismounting. I've come with news. The bank has decided to accelerate the terms of your loan. We'll require payment in full by the end of the month. Elizabeth felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. That's impossible. We had an agreement 6 months. Circumstances have changed, Thornton replied smoothly. However, I have a solution. He gestured to the men beside him. Mr. Weber here represents the Texas and Pacific Railway. They're interested in purchasing land for the new rail line to El Paso. Your property is ideally situated. Elizabeth's mind raced. The railway had been the talk of the county for months, but no one had mentioned it coming through San Elizario. I'm not selling, she stated firmly. Thornton's smile turned cold. I'm afraid you misunderstand, Mrs. Garland. Either you sell to the railway and use the proceeds to clear your debt, or the bank will foreclose at the end of the month. Either way, you'll no longer own this ranch. Mason had approached silently and now stood beside Elizabeth. That sounds remarkably like coercion, Mr. Thornton. This doesn't concern you, Hayes, Thornton snapped. Actually, it does, Mason replied, his voice dangerously soft. Because I intend to invest in this ranch as a partner to Mrs. Garland. Elizabeth turned to him in surprise. Mason, I was going to discuss it with you privately, he said, never taking his eyes off Thornton. I have savings from years on the trail, enough to clear the immediate debt and give us time to build up the herd. Thornton laughed. A drifter and a widow with 3 daughters? You'll be bankrupt within a year. I'll take those odds, Mason stated. Now, I suggest you gentlemen leave before I forget my manners. The railway representative cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss this another time. After they departed, Elizabeth turned to Mason, her heart pounding. Did you mean that? About becoming a partner in the ranch? Mason stepped closer. I meant every word, Elizabeth. But there's something else I need to say. He took her hands in his. I know it's only been a few months since Thomas passed, and I respect your mourning. But I've grown to care for you and your girls more than I thought possible. Elizabeth felt tears welling in her eyes. Mason, I can't ask you to take on another man's family and debts. You're not asking. I'm offering. His voice was earnest. I've wandered most of my life, never putting down roots. But being here with you and the girls, I found something I didn't know I was looking for a home. Elizabeth wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the feelings blossoming between them, but fear held her back. The town already talks. They'll say you're only interested in the land. Let them talk, Mason replied. We know the truth. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Elizabeth sat alone in the kitchen, Thomas's wedding ring clutched in her palm. What would you have me do? She whispered to the empty room. The next morning, Elizabeth rode into town alone. She marched into the bank and requested a private meeting with Thornton. I won't be selling to the railway, she announced once they were seated in his office. Thornton's expression hardened. Then prepare to vacate your property by month's end. I'm not finished, Elizabeth continued. I've secured alternative financing. Mr. Hayes will be investing in the ranch as a business partner. She placed a document on his desk. These are the terms. My lawyer in El Paso has already reviewed them. Thornton scanned the papers, his face growing redder by the second. This is highly irregular. Hayes is an unknown entity with no standing in this community. His money spends just the same, Elizabeth replied coolly. And I believe you'll find everything in order. As she turned to leave, Thornton called after her. This partnership won't save you, Mrs. Garland. A woman needs a husband, not a business associate, especially with 3 daughters to raise properly. Elizabeth paused at the door. My daughters will be raised to believe they can be whatever they choose to be, Mr. Thornton, including ranchers. When Elizabeth returned to the ranch, she found Mason repairing the barn roof with Josephine handing him nails. You're teaching my daughter roofing now? She called up. Mason grinned. She insisted on helping, said her hands were steadier than mine. Elizabeth's heart swelled watching them work together. That evening, after supper, she asked Mason to join her on the porch. I accepted your offer at the bank today, she said without preamble. If you're still willing to be a partner in the ranch. Mason's expression was serious. I am. But Elizabeth, I want to be clear about something. My feelings for you and the girls aren't tied to this business arrangement. If all you want is a partner to help save the ranch, I'll respect that boundary. Elizabeth studied his face in the fading light. And if I wanted more than a business partner, then I'd be the happiest man in Texas, he replied softly. Their first kiss was tentative, sweet with promise. When they parted, Elizabeth whispered, We should wait, do things properly. Mason nodded, though his eyes betrayed his reluctance. I'll court you properly, Elizabeth Garland, and when the time is right, I'll ask for your hand. The winter of 1878-79 was harsh on the borderland. Bitter cold swept down from the north, threatening the cattle and testing the ranch's resources. Mason moved from the bunkhouse into the main house to conserve firewood. though everyone understood the real reason. He slept on a pallet in the front room, maintaining propriety while becoming increasingly integrated into family life. As promised, Mason courted Elizabeth with a formality that amused and touched her. He brought small gifts from town hair ribbons for the girls, a brooch for Elizabeth, books for them all to read during the long winter evenings. They established a routine of sitting together after the children were asleep, discussing the ranch and sharing stories of their lives before they met. Elizabeth learned that Mason had lost his family to influenza years before and had been drifting ever since, working cattle drives and taking odd jobs. He'd saved nearly every penny, dreaming vaguely of a place to call his own someday. "I never imagined that place would include a ready-made family," he admitted one night as they sat before the fire. "But now I can't imagine it any other way." By spring, the partnership had stabilized the ranch's finances, and Elizabeth's mourning period was officially over. The town's gossip had shifted from scandalized to merely curious as Mason became a fixture at church and town functions, always respectful and clearly devoted to Elizabeth and her daughters. On Easter Sunday, after church, Mason asked Elizabeth to walk with him while the girls played at a nearby friend's home. "I've been patient," he began, clearly nervous. "I've tried to honor Thomas's memory and give you time to be sure of your feelings." Elizabeth smiled. "You've been a perfect gentleman, Mason Hayes." "Well, that ends today," he declared, dropping to one knee in the town square for all to see. "Elizabeth Garland, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise to love you and your daughters as my own family, to work by your side as an equal, and to never, ever suggest that daughters are anything less than the remarkable blessings they are." Tears sprang to Elizabeth's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Mason. Yes." Their wedding in June was a simple affair, held on the ranch beneath the cottonwood trees. The girls were resplendent in new dresses, and Elizabeth wore a gown of pale blue, refusing the traditional widow's remarriage in lavender. Josephine approached them after the ceremony, her expression serious. "Does this mean we call you Papa now?" she asked Mason. Mason knelt to her level. "That's entirely up to you, Jo. I would be honored, but I also understand that your papa will always be Thomas Garland. I'm not here to replace him, only to love you as he would have wanted. I think I'd like to call you Papa Mason," she decided. "So we remember both of you." That summer brought new life to the Garland Hayes Ranch. The cattle flourished, and Elizabeth discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled them all with joy, though she worried privately about Mason's hopes for a son. "I can see you fretting," he said one evening as they sat on the porch. "Talk to me. If this baby is another girl," she began. Mason cut her off with a gentle kiss. "Then she'll be as magnificent as her sisters." "Elizabeth, I meant what I said about daughters building our legacy. I've seen what your girls are capable of already. Josephine has a head for numbers that rivals any banker's. Catherine has a way with animals that makes her a natural rancher. And Rebecca's determination would put most grown men to shame." He placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "Boy or girl, this child is a blessing, and he or she will grow up knowing that their worth isn't determined by their gender, but by their character and heart." Word spread quickly about Elizabeth's pregnancy, reigniting the town's gossip mill. During a trip to the general store that fall, she overheard Mrs. Thornton speaking to another woman. "Fourth time's the charm, perhaps. Maybe she'll finally give that poor man a son to inherit all he's building." Elizabeth placed her purchases on the counter with deliberate calm. "Mrs. Thornton, I couldn't help but overhear your concern about my family. Rest assured, Mr. Hayes and I will be equally delighted with a daughter or a son. Our ranch will be inherited by all our children, regardless of gender." Mrs. Thornton flushed. "Well, I never Never considered that a woman might be capable of running a successful business? Elizabeth finished for her. Perhaps you should visit our ranch sometime. My daughters would be happy to show you how they help with the cattle, keep the books, and are learning every aspect of ranching. They're quite remarkable. That December, as snow dusted the San Elizario landscape, Elizabeth gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Mason paced the porch for hours as the midwife worked, and when he was finally allowed inside, he found Elizabeth propped up in bed with two small bundles. "Meet your son and daughter," Elizabeth said, her voice tired but jubilant. Mason's face reflected wonder as he carefully took each infant in turn. "They're perfect," he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. They named the boy Thomas, after Elizabeth's first husband, and the girl Clara, after Mason's mother. The household adjusted to the chaos of twins, with the older girls pitching in to help care for their new siblings. By the spring of 1880, the Garland Hayes Ranch had expanded to include neighboring land purchased from a family moving back east. The railway eventually came through, but on terms negotiated by Elizabeth and Mason that benefited the ranch rather than destroying it. Spencer Thornton's bank failed during the financial panic of 1881, and it was Elizabeth who offered him a position managing the ranch's increasingly complex finances. His initial reluctance to work for a woman was overcome by the reality of his situation, and over time, he came to respect her business acumen. 5 years after their wedding, Elizabeth and Mason hosted a gathering to celebrate the ranch's success and the opening of their new cattle company office in town. The three older girls, now teenagers and pre-teens, helped serve refreshments while Mason proudly carried 3-year-old Clara on his shoulders. Thomas trailed after Josephine, trying to mimic her every move. Spencer Thornton raised his glass in a toast to the Garland Hayes family and their remarkable legacy. Elizabeth caught Mason's eye across the room, her heart full. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, she found him staring out the window at the prosperous ranch that stretched before them. "What are you thinking?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "About legacies," he replied, turning to face her. "About how the people who mocked you for having no sons couldn't see what was right in front of them, that your daughters were always your greatest strength." "Our daughters," she corrected gently. "Our daughters," he agreed. "Josephine's already running half the business operations. Catherine's breeding program is producing the finest horses in the county. And Rebecca shows every sign of being a natural leader. And Clara will probably outshine them all, stubborn as she is." Elizabeth laughed. "Like her mother?" Mason teased, pulling her closer. 10 years after they married, the Garland Hayes Cattle Company was one of the most successful operations in West Texas. Josephine, now 23, managed the business side with a Harvard-educated husband who had the good sense to appreciate her intelligence. Catherine, at 21, ran the horse breeding program that had become famous throughout the territory. 18-year-old Rebecca was preparing to study veterinary medicine back east, one of the first women admitted to the program. Thomas and Clara, at 8 years old, were already showing their own talents, Thomas with a gift for storytelling that suggested a future in law or politics, and Clara with a fierce determination to ride and rope better than any boy in the county. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Mason surprised Elizabeth with a new sign for the ranch entrance: Garland Hayes Ranch, building a legacy through daughters and sons. As they stood together admiring it, Elizabeth leaned into her husband's embrace. "Remember when they mocked me for having no sons?" Mason nodded, his arm tightening around her waist. "And I said daughters would build our legacy." "You were right," she said, watching as their 5 children raced across the field on horseback, the girls leading the way with confidence and skill. "No," Mason corrected, turning her to face him. "We were right. Together." He kissed her tenderly, still as in love as the day they married. And our legacy is just beginning.